Sure. So, so the question is, what are some possible explanations for this empirical regularity, what we call the 3 degrees of influence rule, where we notice across a diverse set of phenomena, your actions, behaviors, thoughts, etc., seem to be associated with the actions, behaviors, thoughts, etc., of other people who are your friends, but not further, typically. The important thing to realize is that it's not always 3 degrees. Sometimes it's none. Not everything spreads. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 4, but it's often 3. And the question is, what are some possible explanations for this? So one idea is that it's just simple decay. It's like the children's game of telephone. So I make you happy, you make her happy, she makes you happy, and at each step of the way it decays, a kind of social friction. That's pretty straightforward to understand. It's kind of, you can use information theory, you can think of a decay in the signal, or you can go physical analogies and think of friction. You talk about how if you drop a rock in a pond, the wave doesn't cover the surface of the earth, the wave dies down. That's because as the wave propagates through this viscous medium in the water molecules dissipate the energy in the form of friction, and the water molecules, the heat, the temperature rises slightly again. So that's one example. The second explanation is this sort of, you can analogize to the electron shell model. So here the idea is that the people that are at a shell 4 degrees removed from you at a geodesic distance of 4, they're constantly turning over. Those people that are your friends today are not going to be there tomorrow or 6 months from now. Because if I start trying to get from you to those people that are at geodesic distance of 4, any step of the way, something could happen. One of your friend's friends could move, or your friend's friend could die, or your friend could break his or her tie with his friend. And so anything could go wrong between you and those people at 4 degrees removed. So the people that are 4 degrees removed from you at any given moment are in constant flux. Whereas the closest group, the S shell, the people that are 1 degree removed from you, are very close to you. They don't really change much from time to time. But at the further distance they do. And so the argument is if you send a message to someone 4 degrees removed from you, by the time it gets there, there'll be different people there. So there's no way to affect that person that was 4 degrees removed from you today. If you whisper something or send a signal, it'll be gone. There'll be a different person there. So that's the second idea. And the third idea is that we evolved, this is very speculative, we evolved to live in groups of about 150 or so people, as the Hodson paper suggested, and really we did not evolve the capacity or the ability to send or receive signals that are so weak as to come from 4 degrees away. And so there's something sort of evolutionarily, something about the evolutionary size of our groups that helps guide that. That's a good question. These are just speculations, mostly. Other questions from the module on networks? Okay. So last time we discussed the nature of material, human, and social capital, and we talked about how social capital can be seen as an emergent property of social systems. And we explored aspects of social capital and how it can affect health. We considered norms, information channels, and appropriable organizations as forms of social capital. And we considered the public goods nature of social capital, which helps to explain why there is underinvestment in it. Now today I'd like to turn to how another macro-social structure, the neighborhood where you live, and we're going to sort of think a little bit about what we mean by neighborhood over the course of today, affects your health. And this would seem to be a rather obvious contention, that the neighborhood would affect your health, but the pathways and the processes of geographic effects on an individual's life chances can in fact be very hard to tease out. And actually, before I launch into today's lecture, let me say a couple things about the next midterm, which is on Thursday. The format is going to be identical to the last one. There'll be 6 questions, pick 5, 1 per page, the same exact cover page as the last time. Make sure you put your name and ID number or whatever at the top of every page. Leave one of them blank, one of the 6 questions blank, put an X through it. Similar length, similar mix of things, some drawing from the readings, some drawing from slides, from the lectures, some just drawing from just general understanding of what's happening in the class. And that's what it's going to be like. Any questions about that, actually, about the logistics or the content? It'll just be since the last midterm, just the lecture since the last midterm. So if you've been doing the readings, which aren't too onerous, and if you've been coming to lecture or viewing lectures or viewing the slides, you're going to be fine. Any questions about the midterm? The final exam is going to be synthetic of the whole class and will engage, you'll have 2 sort of 7-page essays to write out of. Either we'll give you 2 pairs, pick 1 from each pair. Sometimes we'll give you 3 pairs, pick 1 from each of 2 pairs. We haven't decided yet. Each about 7 pages long. We'll work out the precise distribution and collection mechanics, which we'll announce in a couple of weeks, and they'll be, due during the proper period. Yeah.
For those papers, will they be referring only to the things that?
No, it'll be the entire class, and I'm going to try to come up with questions that integrate across the entire class. So I don't. What?
Research outside the paper?
No, you do not need to do a single piece of research outside. It will all be either contained, like a typical thing for me to do on the final will be to find like something in the news and give you like a news clipping and say, now read this thing and then talk about these aspects of it. So if there's any additional reading, you'll be provided it or directed to a website. But you're not expected to do any research. If you've done it, in fact, we prefer you not to go check. So just read what's, incorporate the material. So classic questions for me would be things like, I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but there have been obvious, you guys are Yale's, for God's sakes, there's been like suicides come up repeatedly, methodological and visual inholism has come up, emergence has come up, structure versus agency has come up. And these are the big themes of the class, and some engagement with those themes is a very typical thing that a professor would ask you, with some illustration and some parts. Other questions? Okay. So, all right, so the midterm is going to be on Thursday, the next midterm. Now, which colleges at Yale have which reputation? So name a college that has a reputation for me. Yeah.
Esther's the best college.
Esther's the best college. Yes, okay, I'll stipulate that. Other than that, good. Yes? Okay, I know TD is far, but I'm asking a different question. I'm asking like... Okay, TD is far from unspecified where. It's not far from here, I just have to say. And I know Sabre has a certain reputation as well, which we won't go into. But yes. What's your name?
Lauren?
Lauren, yeah.
Jonathan Edwards has a reputation to be really close and like kind of snobby.
J is snobby. Okay. Now, okay, so J is snobby. All right, let's put another couple of ideas on the table before we explore why J might be snobby. Yes?
Berkeley is the most attractive.
Most attractive. Okay, I'm not asking for descriptions. I'm not ever like, yes, Berkeley is a beautiful college. I will grant you that. Oh, the people are the most attractive. Oh, okay. Berkeley is handsomest college. Okay. Other ideas, yeah. Incestuous. Okay, TV is incestuous. So what do you mean by that?
Like a lot of us tend to correlate TV, and it's kind of hard to break into that circle.
Is that, I'm assuming you've tried? Okay, so TV is very incestuous, and a lot of hookups within group hookups are greater than outside group hookups. Okay, what else? Other ideas for colleges and reps? Yes. Trumbull's athletic. Okay. Your peers do not appear to agree with you on that. Trumbull is athletic. Other ideas? Yes? Pearson has a low GPA. They did 30 years ago, too. I think that's when we had I don't know if you guys still did that 30 years ago when I was here, you did Ting, Tang, and GPA. You still have that? Ting, Tang, and GPA. Some of you don't know what that is? Oh my God. Okay, so the Ting Cup is like the athletic cup, and you're like the large sergeant. And I forgot what the GPA thing was called. The Gimbal Cup, yes, the Gimbal Award-winning college. Styles was Gimbal Award-winning college every year that I was there. Anything about that? I had nothing to do with it. So the gimbal, and I think that's like, they take the high, I forgot how they used to compute that. Like there's some very esoteric way to do it. And then tank cup, which we're not going to discuss. I'll let you guys discuss with each other. Okay, so which Trumbull is the most athletic. Other ideas for which college has which rep? Okay, so let's discuss some of these. Let's start with the TD lookup one, which is the most interesting one. Why would TD have this rep of being incestuous? What might explain what the cause of this is? It's so far, but why would TD's distance from unspecified location contribute to their have a different kind of hookup culture? Yeah, you're handing back.
Unlike most colleges, all people at TD live within TD. So freshmen and
well, Silliman's that way too. Silliman is obviously not as sexy as TD.
yeah, that's one.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so something about the presence of freshmen apparently is increasing the hookup culture at TD. I'm not going to go there, but okay, other ideas. Okay, that's possible. So something about the freshmen at TD. Yes.
I think TD is a smaller group compared to Sullivan, so it's more close knit.
Okay, so it could be the size of TD, the freshmen at TD. What else? Yeah.
It's so far away that no one can get there to hook up with someone.
Okay, no long distance hookups. Not worth it. Oh man, standards are low. Not worth it. Why? Because it's too much trouble to get there, or because you don't like what you find when you get there? Okay, other ideas about TD. Why TD might be so incestuous, have this hookup reputation? Yeah, Shona?
Well, going along with things like it's too far, then for TD people just need to convenient to have everything happen.
Okay. So our arguments are that there are some structural features of TD, something about the neighborhood of TD, the size of the neighborhood, the isolation of the neighborhood, the presence of certain young people in the neighborhood, the freshmen, all of which somehow combine to give it this reputation that many of you, let's say, might be willing to grant. This one student proposed it, but it seems like some of you, most of you, there's something about TD that's different. Okay, what about JE smugness? What do we attribute that to? Why is JE smug? The big endowment. So I didn't know this, but JE, I knew that. I thought that had been equalized. But JE apparently, allegedly, has this big endowment. And what does that do to the people that are at JE?
They get cooler things.
They get cooler things. Like what do they get?
We get lobster.
You get lobster. We. Oh look, we. we get lobster at TD. I'm sorry, at JE. TD gets other things. You can pick which one you'd rather have. So they get lobster because of their big endowment. What else? Why else might JE have a smug reputation? Yeah.
We.
Yeah.
Well, also they get tickets to see shows in New York, so they bring their own culture.
So New York shows. So something about the wealth of this neighborhood is contributing to the students at JE having a certain rep or a certain culture being instantiated and sort of recapitulated at JE. What did we say about Berkeley? Berkeley was the which college? Oh, the handsomest. Yes, most attractive. Does anyone else want questionable? Does anyone else want to second that idea about Berkeley? No, that's an idiosyncratic opinion. We're going to just ignore that. Okay, let's stick with, and Trumbull is the most athletic, other than the Trumbull athlete. Does any other person have any ideas about this? No, okay, we're going to scratch that too. So we're going to stick with TD and JE as our examples. Now, could it be the students at those colleges that give the colleges these reputations? Yeah, Leila.
I mean, it isn't really, like, everyone comes in sort of equally random, but then, like, JE will have that reputation of always winning the tank cup. So, like, it's like college culture, it's not really.
Yeah, so the students are, by and large, there's certain exceptions, by and large, randomly assigned. So we don't think it's the student, we don't think it's the human capital that's causing this, right? That's causing the colleges to be in this fashion. Yeah.
I was going to say that's not necessarily true. I think JE has, like, more legacies than most of the
Yeah, so there's a little subtlety about how that's assigned. So most of you, if any of you had relatives at Yale before you came here, raise your hands if you had relatives at Yale before you came. not so many, some people. So if you had a grandparent or a parent or a sibling or whatever, you had Yale, I don't know how close a relative it has to be, but my older brother had gone to Yale, so when I got to Yale, I was given the choice of either being in Styles, where he had been randomly assigned. He was the first person in my family to go to Yale as an undergraduate, or to not be in Ezra Styles. So I don't know if I think you're still given this choice, right? So what happens apparently is that, so I did not want to be in Silliman for various reasons. And so I had to either take my chances, there's a long story about that, I won't go into it now, and had to do with some people I knew in high school, of certain genders, so I just didn't want to be in Silliman. So I didn't want to take the chance to be in Silliman, so I could pick the short thing and be in Styles. And back then, Styles was not the super cool college it is now. I mean, back then, Styles was like TD. I mean, it was far away, and it was not like it is now. But anyway, but I picked Styles. Now, what happens is the generational thing is, if your parents like went to Brantford or JE, the probability that you will choose to be in that college is very high. So it's probably the case, and I don't know if this is factually the case. I have no idea. Maybe it's not. I'm making it up. But it's probably the case that the percentage of people with relatives that had previously gone to Yale is probably higher in those colleges. And to the extent that there is like inheritance of features like athleticism, if JE always was most athletic, then their offspring might be. Who the hell knows? We're spinning a long story here. But for the purposes of the intellectual exercise I want you to achieve today, assume it's basically random, which it basically is. It's not the case that the students that went to TD were more incestuous, or more prone to licentious behavior, nor the case that the people who went to JE were more prone to being smug or whatever you said, or lobster desiring people. They were randomly assigned. So it's something about that neighborhood, you see, that fosters that type of behavior or posture with respect to the individuals. So if the pattern that we're describing, that you all were by and large able to describe, persists, despite the fact that students are randomly assigned to colleges, this tells us something very important about what the cause of the neighborhood effect might be. So there are two ways of thinking about what makes one neighborhoods distinctive or different one from another. This is known as the compositional and contextual effects of neighborhoods. So one argument is that neighborhood composition matters. And this is the difference that people make to places. If it were the case that the more athletic students were all selectively put into Berkeley, right? Berkeley was the attractive one. Trumbull. If it was the case that all the most athletic students were put into Trumbull, we would then not be surprised to find that Trumbull really seems to foster and have lots of athleticism and athletes, okay? It would be the people that make the neighborhood have these features, okay? The alternative, and they're not mutually exclusive, just to be very clear, is that neighborhood context matters. And this is the difference that places make to people. So before you were randomly assigned to JE, you were a perfectly normal person, then you get assigned to JE and you become extremely smug. And so it's the neighborhood that gives you this feature. So suppose, for example, neighborhood A had twice the mortality rate of neighborhood B. What if, in fact, everyone in neighborhood A was extremely old, right? Neighborhood A had a really older population than neighborhood B. That could probably account for the difference, right? The composition of the neighborhood explains why neighborhood A seemingly is killing its subjects, its residents, right? It's just the fact that the people who live in that neighborhood, the composition of the neighborhood is different. Alternatively, what if we said that there could be something really bad about neighborhood B, like a toxic factory? Maybe neighborhood A really is killing its inhabitants because of something in the neighborhood. This would be a contextual factor, a contextual feature, something about the context in the neighborhood that's giving a higher mortality rate in that neighborhood, rather than a composition of the neighborhood, rather than the residents in the neighborhood. So today we're going to examine the evidence that context really does matter, even after taking into account composition. Okay? So what we want to ask ourselves is, even after taking into account who is sent to which college, or who lives in which neighborhood, taking into account the attributes of the individuals, do we still find evidence above and beyond the composition of the neighborhood that the neighborhood context matters to the experience of the individuals, that the structure matters for a person's life chances, for the agency. Around the surroundings, the bigger macro factors can affect the micro level of experience. So we're going to look at evidence for that today. Any questions about this? So the question is, how could neighborhoods matter? So what are some attributes of neighborhoods that we could measure that could affect individuals' health? Well, one obvious possibility is the physical environment. The amount of air pollution. For example, in Shanghai right now, it's not a shocker that there's much more respiratory disease in Shanghai than there is in Xi'an. Actually, Xi'an's pretty bad, than Wuhan, okay? So there's a lot of air pollution there. The people who live there, maybe the people who live there are very different. Maybe all the people with weak lungs have moved to Shanghai. That's not what we think has happened. Instead, we think there's something about the air pollution in Shanghai that's making people in Shanghai have worse health, okay? So look at the physical environment, the air pollution, the noise, the housing stock, traffic patterns, and so forth. Another possibility is the service environment. These are now sort of specific things about the neighborhoods that we could sort of say that might influence health. The groceries and fast food outlets and health clinics and the supply of doctors and pharmacies. Something about the kind of, not the physical attributes, but the service environment that might be relevant. And last, something about the social environment. Something about the amount of social disorder or local norms in the neighborhood or the social capital in the neighborhood. Something about those features that make particular neighborhoods be better or worse for their health. So we're going to take a quick look at some of the evidence for the effects of place, these types of effects of place, before focusing on three key examples, two of which are with respect to health. So we're going to talk about the Chicago heat wave and the moving to opportunity experiment as two key examples. And one final example with respect to other outcomes that was also taken from your readings. So, and before continuing, I also want to clarify another very important methodologic point. You do not have to understand this by any stretch of the imagination, the statistics of this, but I really want you to have a good understanding of the intuition behind it. And this is something known as the ecological fallacy. And the ecological fallacy is a fallacy whereby you ascribe to an individual a relationship which is observed at a collective. Okay? Now the important thing to understand about the fallacy is the relationship observed at the collective is true, is a correct description of the world, but it doesn't apply to the individuals within it. Okay? So for example, let's say you looked at 3 different neighborhoods, and you found that in this neighborhood, 1 of the 5 people has cancer, and in this neighborhood, 2 of the 5 people has cancer, and in this neighborhood, 3 of the 5 people has cancer, shown in black. And then, as it so happened, in this neighborhood, 1 person was wearing a hat, and in this person, 2 people were wearing hats, and in this people, 3 people were wearing hats. If you look at the percentage of inhabitants wearing hats on the x-axis, and the percentage with lung cancer on the y-axis, there's a perfect relationship between the two. And that's true at the neighborhood level. But this does not mean that hat wearing causes lung cancer at the individual level. You understand? So this is not the case. A relationship that you observe at the individual level cannot necessarily apply, typically does not apply, at the individual level. So in fact, concluding that hats cause lung cancer would be wrong, and this illustrates the ecological fallacy. But this fallacy is only relevant if we're trying to make individual level claims. That is, it's only relevant if we're trying to claim that an association seen at the neighborhood level also necessarily holds at the individual level. However, if we are actually affirmatively interested in neighborhood effects, we don't have to worry about this. Because maybe, for example, hat wearing goes with tobacco purchasing. Or maybe hat wearing goes with wealth. And maybe wealth is associated with lung cancer at the neighborhood level. Something about the neighborhood contributing to people's acquiring the lung cancer. The mechanism is not that wearing hats causes lung cancer, but there's something that's happening at the neighborhood level. Yeah?
But that graph shouldn't only be analyzing people who have cancer and not the whole, like shift away.
Yes, if you were doing an individual level analysis, that's exactly right. And if you did an individual level analysis, comparing hat wearing to non-hat wearing, like you did a case control study of hat wearers and cancer patients and non-cancer patients and looking at whether or not they wore hats, you wouldn't find a relationship necessarily. But if you do a group level, if you look at the percentage of each of these 3 groups that has hats, that's the data, and the percentage of lung cancer, it maps just like that. 20% of this group has HAPS, 20% has lung cancer. 40% wears HAPS, 40% has lung cancer, and so forth. It would seem it's a perfect prediction, and it is, but the point is it's not hat wearing that causes lung cancer at the individual level. Okay? It's not causing it at the individual level. Yeah?
Sorry, I'm just confused. If you said at the neighborhood level, that this is working, like, you like, hat wearing causes you to buy tobacco, and that's causing problem. Or like, hat wearers often buy tobacco.
No, not hat wearers. Places in which people are more prone to buy hats, maybe places in which there's more tobacco for sale. It's not the same people necessarily. I mean, it can be. So the point is not the details. The point is that the two intellectual points. Let me finish my summary, and then I'll do it. Well, let me just tell you now. The two main intellectual points are observations that you make at the neighborhood level can be true, but those associations don't necessarily apply at the individual level. Okay? It's a true statement that the fraction of hat wearers is associated with the fraction of cancer patients. But it's not a true statement that wearing a hat increases your risk of cancer. Okay? So if you're affirmatively interested in neighborhood effects, you don't have to worry about this ecological fallacy being a problem if you're just making statements about the neighborhood level. But we do have to be careful in our interpretations and in our statistical analysis regardless. That is, it is one thing to study the effects of place or the association of group-level observations with respect to individuals, but it's another to assume that these effects are actually operating at the individual level. Moreover, if we are actually interested in the effects of place at the individual level, we need a more sophisticated set of analyses to avoid this fallacy, one that takes into account individual attributes and that is also then estimated at the individual level. So if you did an individual level analysis here, you would see that hat wearing does not cause lung cancer at the individual level. But if you did a group level or neighborhood level analysis, you would see there is a relationship between hat wearing and cancer prevalence in the community. All right? So you might find, for instance, that more religious communities are more healthy. But that doesn't mean that you being religious will make you more healthy. It may be that more religious communities build more hospitals. And it may be that you going to a hospital makes you more healthy. So it's not necessarily, but it's still the case that more religious communities have higher levels of health. You kind of understand what I'm saying? So you can make a statement about the individual at the group level, there's nothing wrong with that, but you cannot translate it to the individual level without additional thought and methodologic effort. So here's a particularly well done study looking at small area effects on cardiovascular events that actually tries to avoid some of these problems. This is the so-called ARIC study, the Atherosclerosis Risk and Community Study. It involved 4 communities around the country, 13,000 residents that were followed for nearly 10 years, and among those residents, those people, there were 615 incident coronary events. And they measured neighborhood disadvantage of block groups. They divided these 4 areas into nearly 600 little neighborhoods. A block group is a census census measure that has a group of, let's say, 4 or 6 blocks. So you have blocks, and then 4 or 6 blocks is a block group, and you could think of that as a sort of the smallest neighborhood you could imagine. Or it's really not, I mean, block might be even smaller, but it's a very small level measure of neighborhoods. So they divided these 4 communities into nearly 600 block groups. They had 13,000 residents, and 600 of them eventually had a coronary event, a heart attack or something like that. And they're asking the question, does something about the neighborhood in which you live, something about the disadvantage, affect your health, your cardiovascular disease? Now, it can be the case that both are true. It can be the case that if you are poor, your poverty increases your risks of heart disease. And we know that's the case, we saw that earlier. But above and beyond that, it can be the case that if you live in a poor neighborhood, your poor neighborhood can be associated with whether or not you have a heart disease. Unlike the hat example, this could also be the case. Okay, we don't think that hat wearing causes lung cancer, but we may think that the poverty in the neighborhood around you, by a mechanism which we can explore, is associated with your individual risk of coronary artery disease. But if we're going to make that claim, we want to adjust for the composition of the neighborhood. Okay, so if we want to make the claim that something about your neighborhood is, there's something real about this neighborhood that is increasing the risk of coronary artery disease, we want to take into account the composition of the neighborhood. Maybe poorer people are living here, or maybe people with less education or different occupations. We want to see whether above and beyond that is something about the neighborhood affecting people's life chances. And so here are the results for this study. This shows the neighborhood disadvantage in coronary heart disease. And this shows the level of neighborhood disadvantage. And this shows for personal income groups. So these are the poorest people. And amongst the poorest people, those living in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods had, after controlling for their own income, had the highest incidence of cardiovascular events, followed by the people living in the middle neighborhood and in the least disadvantaged neighborhood. And the same kind of monotonically declining pattern was observed in the middle income, and among the high income, there was not as much difference here, but let's say there was, for the sake of argument for a moment. Even amongst the richest in this group, we might find that actually living in the most disadvantaged neighborhood was worse for you than living in the least disadvantaged neighborhood. So above and beyond your own income, something about living in a poor neighborhood was worse for your health. Okay? And note here that rather than looking at income inequality of the local area, here we are looking at the actual average income of the local area. So we are not now, this is not a statement about inequality, which is something we had talked about a few lectures ago. We said, what is it about the income inequality around you that's associated with your health status? Now we're saying, what is it, something about the wealth of the people around you that may affect your own health net of your own wealth? And there's some effect in this study. And here's an aspect of the physical environment. The number of streets you have to cross when going to school can logically affect whether you are injured in the course of your life. So here this shows the injury rate per 1,000 people on the y-axis and the average numbers of streets crossed on the x-axis, and for various police districts. So we plot for various police districts these two relationships, and it seems like the more streets you have to cross to get from point A to point B, when you're going to school, for example, the more likely you are to have lifetime prevalence of injury. So this is something obvious about the physical environment. Maybe if we put our schools in locations which require children to cross more streets when they get to school, compared to not having to cross as many streets, depending on where we position the schools, we'll place the kids for increased level of injury above and beyond any attribute of the individual. So something about the built environment affecting your health here in this example. So the layout of streets and the location of schools over which you may have very little control can place you at risk. And again, notice here that these dots are police districts, dot by dot. These are not human beings. We're not measuring this person's lifetime injury rate and versus the number of streets he or she has to cross. We're looking at the people that live in this school district. There's a relationship between their injury rate and this number of streets crossed. We could then go and see whether in fact they're more likely to be hit by cars while crossing the street. It needn't be the case that they have higher injuries that accrue to them because they cross streets. It could be that neighborhoods which are built in a fashion that require you to cross more streets are neighborhoods which have more violent criminals in them, who can maneuver through the streets in some way. And they're the ones that are getting you, okay? It's not the actual street crossing necessarily. So looking at data like this, you cannot willy-nilly just say, even though it's quite reasonable in this case, you cannot willy-nilly say the number of streets a person has to cross in the course of their day is associated with their lifetime injury risk. Probably is, might well be, but that's not what these data say. That would be an ecological fallacy. Okay? Yeah?
Would it still be a problem if the y-axis you were measuring injuries from getting hit by a car?
It could still be, yes. But ultimately, what you'd like to do is measure each individual and say, okay, what are your risks of being injured by a car in this next year period? I measure and observe you. And then I also measure and observe how many streets you have to cross. And then I go on to the next person, I measure those same two variables. And then the next person, I measure the same two variables. Then I can make a statement about whether your street crossing is associated with your injuries. That's different than I look at this third of the class and I say, how many streets on average you have to cross, how many injuries on average you have, and then this third, and then that third, and then I plot those lines. That would be like the hat wearing example. That relationship wouldn't necessarily hold at the individual level. Okay? You don't need to understand this level of detail about this whole thing. The only thing I want you to understand about the ecological fallacy is that if I show you a relationship like this, which has not individuals as the data points, but groups, that relationship between the two parameters is a true description of the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that same relationship holds at the individual level. Okay? Did I answer your question? Yeah? What was your name again? Will. Okay, here's another example. Where you live affects what recreational facilities you have nearby. So this is recreational facilities in 2 neighborhoods in Glasgow, Scotland. So this is the rich neighborhood and the poor neighborhood. Let's add things up. Here's a number of athletic tracks, 2 versus 1. Boating pods, none in the poor neighborhood. Bowling greens, 12, 0 in the poor neighborhood. Cycle tracks, 1 and 0. Playing fields, 15 and 0. Playing greens. Golf courses. I thought this was particularly entertaining because it's in Scotland. So there's 1 golf course in the affluent neighborhood and 2 in the poor neighborhood. So that's a bit of a reversal. Tennis courts, 17 and 4. Swimming pools, 4 and 4. And so overall, if you just kind of summarize this, there's 61 types of recreational facilities. There's 61 recreational facilities in the rich neighborhood and 28 in the poor neighborhood. So this is something about the built environment that could potentially relevant to the health of the constituent individuals. Or here's another thing. This is a kind of crowdsourced example. This is bedbugregistry.com. This was founded a few years ago. It's a kind of crowdsourced way of recording whether or not there are bed bugs in hotels. People around the country, you can go there and you can sign up. This is a free public database of users submitted bed bug reports across the United States and Canada. It was founded in 2006, and so far it's collected over 20,000 reports covering 12,000 locations. So you can plot the prevalence of bed bugs in Manhattan according to on this map, and see, do some neighborhoods have more bed bugs than other neighborhoods, and how might this potentially affect people's health. So where you live affects whether you're exposed to bed bugs above your own. This is like pollution example, above your own attributes. And here's an aspect of the service environment. So where you live affects the availability of fast food outlets. I think this data was taken from Australia. I can't remember right now. So this is a weekly income in the district, and this is the population per outlet. And the richer neighborhoods have higher numbers of people per fast food outlet. So more fast food outlets per person. And the poorer neighborhoods have fewer people per fast food outlet, so more fast food outlets per person. Okay? So the availability of fast food varies according to the wealth of the neighborhood. If you live in a poor neighborhood, there's higher availability per capita of fast food locations. So here's another example of a medical service, which, like bed bugs, was measured in New York City. This shows where you live can affect the kinds of medication you can get. This shows opioid pain relief supplies in pharmacy in New York City neighborhoods. This is something that really sticks in my craw and pisses me off. So this is the racial ethnic composition of the neighborhood. % black, less than 10, up and more than 40% black. This is the total number of pharmacies. So, there are more pharmacies in the, and also more pharmacies per capita in the less black neighborhoods. So the whiter neighborhoods have more pharmacies. And then you look at the fraction of those pharmacies which have opioids available for sale. This is not drug dealers. These are pharmacies where if I write a prescription for my patient to have morphine to relieve their suffering at the end of life, can the patient fill the prescription? And it turns out, if you're black or live in a black neighborhood, you only have a 1 in 3 chance, a 30% chance that your neighborhood pharmacy will stock opioids, compared to a 61% chance over there. So now there may be all kinds of reasons for this. These pharmacies may rationally believe there's greater risk for crime. They're in poor neighborhoods who, I'm not criticizing the judgment of the pharmacies. I'm a little. But the main point is that whether you're able to access prescription medication also can depend on what neighborhood you live in. And in fact, place matters quite a lot in healthcare as well. All kinds of things are shown to have what is known as small area variation. And in fact, the American experience of illness and death varies remarkably from one community to another. Here's an example of whether a person, and it varies from one community to another in all kinds of ways. For example, whether a person is hospitalized or admitted to an ICU unit or visited a doctor and so on, all vary substantially from place to place. This slide shows geographic variation according to 306 so-called hospital referral regions in the use of doctors near the end of life, taken from a very famous resource called the Dartmouth Atlas, put out by the Dartmouth Medical School. So what they did is, and they've been doing this for years, They defined about 306 geographic regions in the country, defined in various ways I won't go into, but they're shown here highlighted in different colors of blue. You can see the little outlines. These are hospital referral regions. These are catchment areas for particular sets of healthcare providers. And then they measure things about those areas and how they vary from place to place. So this slide shows that where you live affects whether you use a specialist at the end of life. And this shows the ratio of rates of medical specialist visits during the last 6 months of life compared to the United States average. So the bluer dots, you are more likely to see a specialist. The lighter dots, you're less likely to see a specialist. So unless you think there's a big difference from place to place in who lives there and also how they're dying and what they're dying of, and there's some such difference for sure, there's some variation by composition that may explain this, most of this difference is probably due, in fact, is due to context. There's something different about healthcare in these areas that modifies the experience of the people within the areas, just like the JE and the TD example. Part of it may have to do with who winds up in these neighborhoods, but most of it has to do with what is the structure of the healthcare system in those areas that leads to substantial variation from place to place in the fraction of people seeing specialists in the last 6 months of life. And in fact, in addition to this, the chance that a decedent was an inpatient in an acute care hospital at the time of death varied by a factor of nearly 3 from place to place. Here we're defining the neighborhoods as quite big. From less than 20% to almost 50% across parts of the country. Or the chance of being admitted to an intensive care unit at the time of death varied by a factor of nearly 5, from about 6% to almost 30% of all deaths. So in some parts of the country, when you die, you have a 6% chance of being admitted to an ICU before you die, and in other parts, a 30% chance of being admitted. And it's not so much because of what you want or because of who you are, it's not the composition of the population that might matter, it's the context that might matter. And where you live even affects whether you have sensible, vaccinated neighbors or whether you are surrounded by people who, frankly, incredibly foolishly and I would say sociopathically, actually, avoid vaccination. Because they not only place themselves at risk, they place others at risk, and they're doing so on the basis of no sound scientific evidence. Given the negative externalities of vaccine refusal, like when externalities, how my actions affect you, and the manifest public interest in epidemic control, the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1905, over 100 years ago, in a landmark case that states could pass and enforce compulsory vaccination. But states could allow exemptions for diverse reasons, including religious or personal reasons. And people have begun to abuse this. Initially, this wasn't really a problem. If a few people came forth and they said that for reasons of their religion or other personal compelling reasons they didn't wish to be vaccinated, those were so small that we still had herd immunity in our population and they didn't put anyone else at risk. But now those numbers are rising, whipped up in part by actresses who have no idea what they're talking about, and actually are beginning to place the public, especially those among us who are the most vulnerable, the elderly, newborn babies, and the immunocompromised, at risk from vaccine refusal. And so this shows geographic clustering of non-medical exemptions. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about people who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, and there are reasons that can apply. This shows a geographic clustering of non-medical exemptions can result in the local accumulation of a critical mass of susceptible children. And the county-level rate in the state of Washington of exemptions from vaccinations varies from 1.2% to 26.9%. So there are some counties in Washington where nearly a third of the children are not being vaccinated. This is in the United States of America. After the invention of vaccines, which are incredibly safe, we are having measles outbreaks and polio, not yet, but measles outbreaks and other outbreaks, which are, we are getting in some case of polio, which are affecting people. So this shows the exemption rate and how it varies, and the green are the highest levels of exemption rates, and you can see certain counties, Jefferson County, Thurston County, Skamania County, and so forth. You can see the rates from place to place in vaccine refusal. But and this geographic clustering of vaccine refusal can result in outbreaks in area populations, including amongst innocent bystanders. I would argue that actually when you choose not to vaccinate your children, they are the innocent bystander as well. It's like you can't choose not to transfuse your child who's, even if you're a Jehovah's Witness, we talked about this a few times ago, but certainly you choose not to vaccinate yourself if you're an adult or transfuse yourself, but the state has a compelling interest in intervening in parents who don't want to treat their kids for cancer or other kinds of conditions. You could make this argument about vaccination as well. But unusually in this case, the unvaccinated children tend to be richer and whiter and have a married mother with a college education. So this is a very unusual case in which higher SES is associated with sort of worse health choices and worse health outcomes. So you have outbreaks of measles amongst relatively wealthy communities, rather wealthier than you would expect compared to poor communities. I feel pretty strongly about the anti-vaccination movement, actually. I think it's doing a huge amount of harm to our country, and I don't think there's much scientific basis for it. Yeah?
Just what you're saying about like being richer and whiter, like that, the green areas in Washington State, those are not the blue white areas in Washington State.
Yes, I believe you on that, but I'm just saying that if you do it now, if you look at the paper, they talk about how those attributes of individuals do place you at higher risk. Yeah.
Somewhat related note, how do you think we go about, what is the best way to go about like transmitting those myths and getting people to not believe?
I think you need, that's why I'm trying to make a very forceful statement about it. I don't think we gain anything by being wishy-washy about this. This is like the kind of Fox News, like someone says the earth is round. Well, other people say the earth is flat. Let's discuss the controversy. There's really not a lot of controversy amongst anyone scientific about this. And if we have any belief in the capacity of human beings to observe and know the world, unless you think everything is relative and just everything is up for your opinions, if you believe that there is such a thing as science, that the world is knowable, and we can agree on the terms of that, okay, so then we can say, okay, what are the experiments and studies we would need to do to conclude whether vaccination is safe and beneficial? We go do those studies, and then we come back, and that should be dispositive. You can't then come back and then people say, well, I don't believe that study. Okay, fine, what other study would you do? Let's do that too. And then evidence accumulates and you come to an opinion, which is based on fact and which is falsifiable by the scientific method and reproducible. And then you don't need to keep saying, oh, well, but there's other point of view. Well, no, we've considered that other point of view and now we've rejected it. You can't keep considering it forever. So I think one of the things that needs to be said is a very forceful defense of vaccination policies. Now, I'm not saying that there are no side effects ever to vaccines. That's not the case. There are 1 in 100,000 kids who are horribly harmed by vaccines. 1 in 100,000, 1 in 200,000. And there are other bad effects of certain types of substances in vaccines, although those are being cleaned up. But at the population level, there's no doubt that vaccination is beneficial. That more lives, by 2 orders of magnitude approximately, are saved by vaccination than are lost by vaccination. And of course, when you get the index case of the person who's been horribly harmed, you feel terrible. But that's the nature of public health, right? I mean, we have to make judgments about what's best for the population. So I think one of the ways is to ask the people, say to them, what is the basis by which we should come to the conclusion that vaccines are or are not harmful? If we can agree on terms of what the work would be. If they say to you, there's nothing you can do that will persuade me otherwise, well then it's religion, it's not science. There's no way that you can persuade them. If they say, I have this belief that vaccination is harmful, and nothing you can say will change my mind, then you're like, okay, well, that's your opinion, move on to the next person. But if they say, well, this is what would count as evidence for me, then you have something to work with. Say, okay, how can we get evidence that would persuade you that this is or is not the case? They say, well, it's a conspiracy of the pharmaceutical companies to sell drugs. Actually, that's one I'm sympathetic with. There's a case in Texas where all these girls we rolled out the HPV vaccine in part. Now, it's because it was a friend of the governor. Now, the thing about HPV vaccination is, first of all, both boys and girls should get it, but of course we focus on the girls, which touches on, this would be a great exam question, which goes back to the Emily Martin whole reason why are we focusing on women's bodies rather than on men's bodies. But what we did is this I thought was foolish, is we had, people know about HPV vaccination? Human papillomavirus is one of the leading causes of cervical cancer in women, carried by both men and women. It tends to be asymptomatic in men. We have a nice vaccine for this now, Gardasil. What we did from a public health point of view is we rolled it out amongst little girls. Like when you were little, you're supposed to get this vaccine. We should have done it for both little girls and boys, if we want to even remotely be fair, because we can interrupt the transmission from boys to girls. B, I think if we could have, we would have not done it in little girls. We would have waited until you were 10 or 12 and asked parents to do it just before their daughters became sexually active. Sons too, incidentally. Now, of course, we couldn't rely on the populace to do that, and so what we did is we folded it into the childhood immunization schedule because then we knew we could get the kids at that time. And so that's why it was done. But that's not necessary. 5-year-olds aren't having sex. They're not at risk of, although some people said, and this really broke my heart, some people said that there's enough sexual abuse of young girls that actually, even in that case, it would be sensible to vaccinate all the 2-year-old girls in this country, which is just really heartbreaking. So, but anyway, so the point is like, I think that the way I would approach this is to first speak forcefully in defense of vaccination, but empathetically, because there are many people in this country who are opposed to vaccination, many millions of people, so it doesn't help the cause by just yelling at them, but it doesn't help the cause by just saying, well, you know, on the one hand it's good for you, on the one hand it's bad for you, so let's just toss a coin. I don't think that's right. I think you need to say, okay, well, how are we going to go about tackling this problem? What evidence would count? And can I help you to get the evidence you need? Yeah?
So I know the reading was talking about how a lot of, like, since schools have started mandating that students have to get vaccines, pointed out, like, issues with the vaccination rates have gone down, but do private institutions have the same, like, legal?
I don't know enough about the law to know that. I suspect, I'm pretty sure states could mandate that even private institutions must enforce vaccines. It's a public health problem, right? If you get epidemics of measles or polio, it affects everybody. And especially since we're talking about kids here, the state has two compelling interests. First, to prevent your vaccination behavior from harming me. And second, if you're a minor, to prevent your parents' vaccination choices on your behalf from harming you. Just the same way a state can intervene to take you out if you've been abused by your parents or something like that. So I suspect the states could compel even private institutions to enforce this. We have some weird cases. I'm familiar with some schools where very weirdly the kids are compelled to be vaccinated, but the teachers can get off because it's considered like a working condition, and it's subject to union, or whatever group. The teachers can say we don't want to be vaccinated, and I just think that's wrong. I think it should be a condition of employment if you work in a school that you need to be vaccinated. I mean, we'll allow for certain rare exceptions. That's fine, but you can't have 10% of the teachers in the school not being vaccinated themselves. They're just vectors to transmit the infection to everyone else. Other points about this. So I think this is a classic example of neighborhood effects, actually. It goes and intersects nicely with biology. Now let's take a look at some aspects of the social environment. For example, crime and a general breakdown of the social fiber of the community have been shown to be associated with health outcomes of residents. And here's one way to objectively assess the physical environment in order to get insight into the social environment. And this is the famous so-called broken windows hypothesis, or broken windows index. Some of you may have heard this. So if we want to assess something about the built environment of the neighborhood, we might look at the percent of properties with major structural damage, or street segments with graffiti on them, or street segments with accumulated garbage, or street segments with abandoned vehicles. We might measure these things, go into a neighborhood and count and measure these things, and then combine them into a single index and call these the broken windows index, like the broken windows in the homes which haven't been repaired. And nowadays, things like this can be assessed using big data techniques, often automatically, using things like Google Street View. So even 10 or 15 years ago, when I was an assistant professor, you had to drive in a car with a video camera and look out the window and note these things. Now you can sit in your home and just get on Google Street View and go and inspect any block in the country you want and quantify this. You can even build apps that automatically assess the neighborhood quality by character recognition and the like. And there's a link between this measure and, believe it or not, something like sexually transmitted disease transmission. Even net of the individual poverty of the neighborhood and net of the traits of the individuals involved. So this slide shows the broken windows index and rates of gonorrhea per thousand in New Orleans neighborhoods. So you can look at low poverty neighborhoods and high poverty neighborhoods. And within those neighborhoods, you can look at whether they have low broken windows and high broken windows. And amongst the low broken windows neighborhood, whether you have a low poverty or high poverty, not a lot of difference in the gonorrhea rate in a low broken windows neighborhood. But in a high broken windows neighborhood, first of all, both in the low poverty and in the high poverty conditions, you get increases in the gonorrhea rates, first point. And second point, it's even more, the increase is even more, it doubles versus goes up by 50% in the high poverty neighborhood compared to the low poverty neighborhood. So these people have a double whammy, both being in a high poverty neighborhood and being in a neighborhood characterized by a lot of structural disorder. So it's not just how poor a neighborhood is, but also something about the social fiber of a community that may be quite relevant. And we'll examine how neighborhoods can affect norms with respect to seemingly unrelated behaviors in just a bit. So how could it be that the broken windows is affecting sexual practices? How can that be? And we'll come back to a similar example taken from your readings in just a little bit. Here's an example of what a low broken windows environment looks like, even though this is poor. So this is a poor neighborhood, but this is a low broken windows environment. And so you can imagine that you could characterize neighborhoods not only based on their poverty, but also based on this other feature. And similarly, areas that are relatively free of crime and have greater social cohesion may also have other health effects. For example, have fewer effects during the famous Chicago heat wave of 1995. So in 1995, I actually had just moved to Chicago from Philadelphia. There was this enormous heat wave that lasted several days. People were leaving their houses, like people like you, young people, left their houses where they were living and slept out in the open in parks, like just large numbers of strangers. It was so hot indoors at night. And in my house, we just rented a house and we had one air conditioner, and me and my wife and my 2-year-old and my newborn baby, we all literally huddled next to the air conditioner, which of course was going on periodically because of the power outages since everyone had turned on their AC to stay cool. It was so hot. And in fact, there were over 700 excess deaths during the heat wave, which were unequally distributed across the city. And this slide shows the heat index, or the apparent temperature, which is a function of the temperature and relative humidity, and the total deaths on the y-axis from July 12th to 1995 on the x-axis. So here's the period of the heat wave. Here's the heat index that's really going up during the period of the heat wave. Before it was even lower, and afterwards it was lower. This is just the period of the heat wave. And this is the total deaths in Chicago from all three categories: due to cardiovascular disease, due to heat and cardiovascular disease alone, and due to heart disease alone, really spiking during the peak of the heat wave. But the question is, how do living conditions and types of social contact and neighborhood effects affect the probability of survival? And this is a slide taken from some readings. Did I assign this Semenza paper for today? I don't think so. So this is an analysis that was done looking at individual level attributes that might affect whether you die during the heat wave. And what they found is that if you had access to an air-conditioned lobby in your building, the relative risk of dying, so these are the fraction of people that had access to a relative risk of dying among people who died in the heat wave, 28% of them had access to an air conditioner, compared to matched controls who did not die, 54% of them had access to an air conditioner. So access to an air conditioner seems to reduce your probability of dying, okay? So it reduces your odds of dying by about 80%, down to 0.2. So let's look at some other things. Participating in group activities. 46% of the people who died participated in group activities, compared to 55% of the people who did not die. So how could that be protective? How could participating in group activities protect you from death during a heat wave? Yeah, Hannah. Yeah, you could find someone with an air conditioner, or if you're not coming out to meet an event, people might worry about you. Are you at home dying? Maybe I should go to your house. It's a heat wave. Had access to transportation, had a similar effect, or had a pet in your home. 78% of the people who died had a pet in their home. 99% of the controls who did not die had a pet in their home. Or, I'm sorry, maybe the percentages are here. I'm sorry, the percentages are, I'm correct, these are the absolute counts. The percentages are in parentheses. So 24% of the people who died had a pet in their home. 30% of the people who did not die had a pet in their home. How could having a pet be life-prolonging in a heat wave? Canary, that's a good idea. Oh my God, it's really hot. My pet just died. I better do something. Okay. What else? Yes? Yeah, you can get out of the house. exactly interacting with people. So sociologist Eric Kleinenberg has looked at this in depth in his book called Heat Wave. And here are some results from his comparison of 2 Chicago neighborhoods that had similar socioeconomic parameters, but very different outcomes in the heat wave based on other attributes, such as the social capital and measures of civic life of these neighborhoods, similar to the broken windows idea. So he looked at 2 neighborhoods, North Lawndale and South Lawndale, that had roughly similar levels of seniors living in poverty. This is the Chicago level overall, and this is these 2 neighborhoods. Percent of seniors living alone, not too dissimilar. And heat wave deaths, 10 times as many in North Lawndale compared to South Lawndale in these 2 sort of similar neighborhoods that he was comparing. And here's so North Lawndale is worse. And here's a street view of a North Lawndale neighborhood, and here's a street view of a South Lawndale neighborhood. And so Kleinenberg points to the relevance of commercial life in South Lawndale, also known as Little Village in Chicago, which pulled isolated seniors into public places and which provided them with a safe, air-conditioned commercial venues, for example, where they could cool off. And here's what some residents have to say. Here's a resident of North Lawndale. I had no fear until they told me, oh no, it's not safe. These people steal on the corners and so on. They would tell me that there would be drive-by shootings. They would fight among themselves, but I would be caught in the crossfire. And some feared even that if you walk, they could come and snatch you. Here's South Lawndale, what Father Morales had to say. Even though we have gangs, people still feel comfortable in the streets. You walk around and you see people sitting on the front steps everywhere. Or here's another resident saying, we look out for each other in our neighborhood. If something is going on, we'll see it and call each other or the police. So there's something about the social capital, something about those neighborhoods different than how rich or poor they are, that may help explain the difference between whether people die in a heat wave or do not, whether a person's life chances depend on the neighborhood structure around them. Now, in all of these observational studies, which is what I've been showing you so far today, all observational studies, whether quantitative or qualitative, one can wonder about all kinds of problems in coming to the conclusion that neighborhoods matter. You always have this difficulty of disentangling compositional from contextual effects. Maybe, in fact, there's something different about North Lawndale and South Lawndale residents, and that's what explains their heat deaths, not the neighborhood factors. And this can be addressed by doing a certain kind of statistical analysis called multi-level analysis that takes into account individual level attributes, looks at neighborhood level effects, net of individual level attributes. You can worry about household mobility, people moving into and out of neighborhoods that may be contributing to this. And this can be accounted for by having longitudinal data. Or you can be worried about the problem of endogeneity, or how can you make a really strong causal inference? What is actually causing what in the situation? And here you can rely on sort of certain econometric techniques known as instrumental variables analysis, which are sort of natural experiments, chance randomization. You know, randomization occurs in the world. We didn't do the experiment, it just happened on its own. Or you can do actual experiments. So I want to close with some examples, mostly taken from your readings, of some experiments that people have done to show that neighborhoods can actually affect health. And the outcomes of individuals and the neighborhood features may actually be artifactually related. So when you're trying to identify, does the neighborhood actually have an effect on individuals, you have to worry about a number of problems. First of all, people choose where they live. And those that don't like their neighborhood and are able to do so might move out. Or maybe sick people might move closer to amenities. So there are all kinds of choices that are potentially unobserved that individuals can be making that might be contributing to these neighborhood effects that we think. So maybe we're wrongly concluding that neighborhoods are having an effect when it's just people self-sorting compositions arising in neighborhoods because of choices people are making. And of course, services, choose where to locate. So maybe junk food outlets might move in where there is demand. Maybe it's not the proximity to junk food that's causing you to want to eat more junk food and therefore be worse for it. Maybe you want a lot of junk food, and so a junk food operator knows where to open to meet his or her customer demand. So you need a certain kind of approach, statistical approach, if you're going to really understand whether neighborhoods can cause health outcomes. Here's an example of a study that is almost a full experiment. This shows how where you're hospitalized can affect your recovery. And this was a study published in Science, I don't know, 30 years ago now. And there was a plausibly random assignment of patients to rooms in a hospital floor. And some of these rooms, when you looked out the window, you could see a tree. And some of these rooms, when you looked out a window, you could not see a tree. So these rooms, you could see the trees, and these rooms, you could not. And they looked at the analgesic doses per patient from wall view and tree view groups. And so here's the analgesic strength and whether people were relying on getting analgesics. And they found that on the initial period, there's not much variation between the wall group and the tree group because they all still have postoperative anesthesia. But on the day post-op day 2 to 5, you see that the people that were in the wall group have much higher levels of anesthesia required. So 2.48 doses per person on average per day compared to just under 1, 3.65 compared to 1.74, and so on. So many more analgesic doses required to treat postoperative pain in individuals who don't have a nice neighborhood, who can't see trees, for example. And they also looked at length of stay, and they found that length of stay was about 1 day shorter in people with tree views. And here's another true experiment. In this study that was conducted between 1994 and 1997, over 4,000 families in several cities around the country were randomly assigned to one of 3 different treatment arms. One group was given a housing voucher that could be used to move to a low-poverty neighborhood and were also counseled on how to move. We're given mobility counseling. Another group was given a housing voucher, but they could go anywhere, to a low-poverty neighborhood or to an equally poor neighborhood as where they live. And a control group, a third group, was given no new assistance, but continued to be eligible for public housing. And in 2002, one adult from each family was followed up by interview in 5 domains: economic self-sufficiency, mental health, physical health, risky behavior, and education. So people were randomly assigned, not to a neighborhood, because I can't force you to move from one place to another, but they were randomly assigned the permission to move to a different neighborhood, potentially a rich neighborhood, or just to move, maybe allow to move to another poor neighborhood. And they found that moving to a richer neighborhood, even given a fixed level of human capital, had certain health effects. For example, on major depression. So the low-poverty group, the people that were given a voucher to move to a low-poverty neighborhood, were much less likely to be depressed in this famous moving to opportunity experiment compared to the control group at follow-up. And similarly, obesity was lower, was detectably lower in people that were randomly assigned to be able to move to a same person, randomly assigned to move to a richer, given a voucher to permit them to move to a richer neighborhood. Most of them, but not all of them, moved. Those individuals also had lower obesity at follow-up. Now, lastly, in the readings was a beautiful study that was done. And one of the things I like about the study is the kind of study that undergraduates could do, but it winds up in one of the best journals in science, the name of this journal, Science. And it goes back to the whole broken windows idea that I introduced earlier. So let me close by summarizing some of the key findings of this study and then making some remarks. So this is an alley in Groningen in the Netherlands, located in a shopping area, and it's commonly used to park bicycles. And what the scientists did is they experimentally modified this alley. So in the so-called order condition, the walls of the alley were clean, whereas in the disorder condition, they went in and they covered the walls with graffiti. And they alternated the days in which they put the graffiti on the walls. And there's a standard prohibition sign pointing out the disapproved behavior. So here's the graffiti, and here's the order condition, and here is the prohibition sign, which says no littering. And the sign was highly noticeable, and every subject entering the setting, and they secretly watched what was happening, glanced at the sign. And there were 77 people in each of the conditions, the disorder and the order condition, and who came to attach their bicycles. And in their absence, while they left, a flyer with an elastic band was attached to the handlebar of their bicycle. And it read, "We wish everybody happy holidays." And it was signed by some non-existent sportswear shop. And the flyer had to be removed by the participant to easily use the handlebar of their bike. But because there were no trash cans in the alley, not littering, which is what the sign said, meant taking the flyer with them, putting the flyer in your pocket. And the scientists counted throwing the flyer on the ground or hanging it on another bicycle as littering. Some people just put it on another bicycle. And what they found was a cross-norm inhibition effect. Violating the anti-graffiti norm by putting up graffiti on the wall, people who were exposed to that were more likely to litter. It's not like they were more likely to take a can out and put graffiti up. It was a different effect, similar to the broken windows idea about, let's say, the gonorrhea example that I discussed earlier. A cross-norm effect. Of the participants in the ordered condition, the no graffiti condition, 33% littered compared with 69% of the participants in the disordered condition. So that was one experiment done with just about 150 subjects and a very nice design. Here's another similar experiment they did, which was a bit more taxing. The right-hand sign indicated that it was prohibited to lock bicycles to the fence. And the left-hand sign, which was the so-called target norm, made it clear that it was prohibited to use this entrance and that you couldn't use this entrance to get to the car park. You're not allowed to go right there to your car. You have to walk all the way around 200 meters, like 2 football fields, to get to the car. And so this sign says, no bikes attached to the fence, and this says, don't use this gate. And then they experimentally manipulated whether they violated this norm by attaching or not attaching bicycles to this gate. And then they secretly observed, do people violate this norm? And sure enough, if you're violating the no bicycle attached to the fence norm, people are more likely, if they see that norm being violated, they're more likely to disobey this other rule. Of the participants in the ordered condition, where bicycles were not locked to the fence, 27% stepped through the gap in the fence, compared with 82% of the participants in the disordered condition. So just by enforcing the no bicycle norm. And finally, they did this experiment with theft. Here, they examined whether an envelope visibly containing a €5 note and hanging out of a mailbox would be stolen more often if a contextual norm was violated. So they arranged to put this envelope in the box so that as you walk by the mailbox, you see it, the money, and it's just hanging out there. And then they either put graffiti on the mailbox or not, and they secretly watched whether people stole the money, according to whether there was graffiti on the mailbox or not. And in fact, yet again, they found that of the participants in the baseline order condition of no graffiti on the mailbox, 13% of people stole the envelope, compared with 27% when there was graffiti on the mailbox. So something about the local disorder is changing individuals' behavior, changing their experience. And this is the kind of broken windows hypothesis now, where you experiment. It would be like if I went around to some of the colleges at Yale and started flinging rocks through windows at some of the colleges, and then watched what happened to the students in those colleges. Did they start behaving, like the perpetrator or something? Did you get really serious sociopathy for some reason? I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with Saybrook, but I am suggesting there's something wrong with the perpetrator. So neighborhoods can have an enduring character that affects multiple aspects of our lives and that stays constant across time. They are an aspect of structure that surrounds us, and they have an existence of their own that transcends us. This type of work on health and neighborhoods, as we've seen, faces a set of complicated conceptual and methodological challenges. If you're going to really make claims about neighborhood effects, you have to account for people's mobility, you have to account for compositional effects, you have to be careful about your causal claims, you have to be careful about the ecological fallacy, but still it's possible to make these claims. And a final issue that we haven't really discussed, although we've seen many examples, is how to define neighborhoods to begin with. Do neighborhood effects operate at different levels of size, and does this depend on the outcome being considered? Are we interested in health hospital referral regions, counties, zip codes, census tracts, voting precincts, census block groups, blocks, or alleyways? And of course, different levels may be relevant to different outcomes. When you think about whether your neighborhood is safe or dirty, you think about a few blocks or whether there's a crack house next door. When you think about whether it has a hospital, you think about a broader area, like a city. And when you think about whether the air is polluted or the laws are fairly enforced, you think about still broader areas. Overall, however, neighborhoods have an enduring reality that transcend the people who reside within them. Okay, sorry for the rush at the end here. I spend too much time on vaccination. Are there any quick questions before I let you go? Okay, see you next time.
Is this your new preferred watching spot?